Hi, I'm Ashley Hammond.
And I'm Locke Hammond.
We're married.
We run a business together.
And we homeschool our 4 kids.
That makes us sound a little crazy.
I think people might think we're a little crazy.
Well, through all that crazy, we're here to help you blaze your own trail through a world designed for conformity.
And break the chains holding you back from living an uncommon life.
This is Trailblazers and Chainbreakers. I'm glad we know where your mind is right now.
Yeah. Well, it keeps distracting me.
All right. Let's actually do this.
Okay.
We're going to talk a little bit about relationship today specifically. I'm sure we'll go all over the place. We usually do, but specifically relationship. And you have a quote or an expression, I guess. It actually started as a parenting quote that we've talked about a number of times. And it kind of hit me in a conversation I was having with another guy on one of my coaching calls about marriage. It kind of hit me that this is a really good, we could adapt this into a quote or an expression about relationships and marriage. And so here's the quote we're going off today. What's best for the relationship is not always what's most convenient for you or her. And obviously I'm speaking from the man's perspective. So for you, it could be or him. But I go to like when your relationship isn't going where you want, you're faced with a lot of difficult decisions, and our conditioning, our experiences, our childhood, our life, even our relationship history, whether it's other relationships or that specific relationship, it can all kind of cause us to cling to what's easy over what's best for the relationship. And there's a lot of different ways we can go with this, but when you hear this, what's best for the relationship is not always what's most convenient for you. Where does your mind go?
Mine goes to like our fighting style. So when you and I would get in a fight, I would tend to need time to like think and just be left alone, and you want to deal with things right away. And that isn't the way that I want to do it. And we both tend to not go back to the situation. And so it's not convenient for me to bring up a fight again or to bring up that situation again. But it's what's best for our relationship.
Yeah, that's actually a really good example. That's going to hit, it hits on so many different pieces that I have on my list to cover today. But yeah, we've talked about this in the past on the podcast and many other places, but like our pattern, and there's good reason for it being my side of the pattern and good reason for your side of the pattern, right? So like your pattern when we get into it is walk away, take a step away. No, I don't want to say retreat in a bad way, but remove yourself from the situation to keep yourself safe. And there's a lot of good reasons for that from your childhood. But it also happens to be like my deepest wound. So my pattern is, because of some situations in my childhood, to immediately assume that I'm being abandoned. You're walking away because we're done. It's over. And to follow you and try and resolve the problem. When I see a problem, I want to resolve it for many reasons. Maybe it's a masculine thing. Maybe I know it's partly my abandonment wound, but that's also your deepest wound, to be followed and poked at. And so we created this perfect storm of crap that just kind of made everything worse. So yeah, in that situation, the very first example of what's best for the relationship, well, it's best for me to give you some space, right? Clearly, it doesn't work to chase you down and be like, no, let's resolve this now. You're freaking out. I haven't calmed down because I'm still in that, oh my God, this means we're over stage. So it's not like I'm in a better place either. After we both calm down and you get that space, what's best for the relationship, which is not easy either, is bringing that conversation back up. So we'll talk about difficult conversations, I think, in a minute. And there's also good reasons. I started off by saying our conditioning, our experiences, our childhood kind of lead us into clinging to what's easy. It's a lot easier to never have that conversation again. Well, I guess hope that we'll never have that conversation again, because what ultimately happens is we do, and it ends up being a fight again. But it's a lot easier to not bring up the difficult conversation. You probably don't want to get back into it, create another fight. I don't want to bring it up because at that point I've calmed down. I'm not worried that you're going to leave me forever. And then the risk reward ratio of that conversation seems skewed. So there's a lot of reasons. That was actually a really good example. We hadn't even talked about that example beforehand. So thank you for sharing that. My mind went to, before we get into like a lot of examples of this, my mind goes to this idea that ultimately our ability to do this, our ability to do what's best for the relationship instead of what's most convenient for me, or even me having to do something that's not convenient for you, which we'll talk about too. Ultimately, it comes down to, in my mind, having a vision for the relationship that's bigger than just myself. Maybe this is just my perspective. I want your opinion on this, but like we could actually have an actual shared vision, but also just the acceptance and the understanding for me that our relationship is more than just me plus you, 1+1. To me, when I think about our relationship, it feels almost like it's its own, I don't want to say person, but its own thing. Like it's got a life of its own. It can grow, it can shrink, it can be, even if I'm in a good mood, our relationship can be in a bad mood or a bad place, right? And so I can sacrifice something of myself to nurture our relationship, to grow our relationship. A lot like we've talked about this so many times with kids, we can sacrifice in order to nurture our kids. And it kind of, this actually ties into a recent episode we did, like a couple episodes ago, about understanding how we affect each other differently than how we intended, right? Like the idea that what's perceived is more important than what we intended. But that's where my mind immediately goes to this idea. And this was very helpful for me to get my head around doing the hard, scary things, because that's what's best for our relationship. It was this understanding that this relationship is its own kind of thing. It's separate from me. And it's also brings in this idea, we talked so many times about this, about our relationship is 100% my responsibility. It's also 100% your responsibility. But that takes it and puts it in a different frame for me. That makes it easier for you. What do you think about that? Does that make sense to you? Did I just jumble your brain?
He's kind of jumbled my brain. He just kind of jumbled my brain. But what I was thinking of was how, like, what's really inconvenient but probably best for the relationship is you think about like a fight, or your partner's been super grumpy for a week, or your partner made a mistake and said something really rude, or did something messed up, or isn't doing something that you want them to do that they said they were going to do. So many different avenues you can go down. And it's like there's two people in the relationship. You hear this all the time, but I don't want to be the person. Like, I don't want to be the bigger person. Well, someone's got to do it.
Yeah.
Like, someone's got to be the bigger person. So like, who's it going to be? And there's been so many times in my head where I just want to be like annoyed and angry at you. And I'm like, but I don't want to be the bigger person. Like, but I know the only way to have a shift or it to change is like, I have to take the initiative. Like, I have to be the bigger person. And that quote really hit hard for, I think it's like, it's not convenient for me. My ego tells me no. Everything is telling me no, but yet that's what's best for our relationship.
Yeah.
So kind of what you were just saying, like it's its own identity, the relationship. It is. You have to take yourself, ego out of it. And what is best? Like, what is going to move your relationship forward?
Yeah. You know what?
No, keep going on because I just lost my thought.
Interrupted you.
Yeah.
What that makes me think of, and this is actually, I was going to bring this up towards the end in terms of like, I always try and bring us to like, okay, how the heck do we do this? Right. We just talked about a lot of theory. How the heck do we actually do it? And one of the things that I was going to bring up at the end, and I'll just bring it up now because you made me think of it, is this idea of keeping score. So like, how do we do this? Well, first of all, stop keeping score, because my mind, when you say like, okay, be the bigger person. Why do I always have to be the bigger person? Why do I always have to do this? The immediate kickback that I get anytime I talk to someone, well, I don't want to say anytime because it's not from everybody, but oftentimes if I post about this, whether it's keeping score, being the bigger person, or dropping expectations, or like any one of these things that kind of fit together, or if I'm having an individual conversation with people, oftentimes I will get someone who will say, but that they're going to take advantage of me. Right? Like if I drop my expectations of my husband or my wife, then she's never going to do anything and I'm going to get taken advantage of. It's like, well, you're still in the keeping score mindset, right? You can't do what's best for your relationship if you're keeping score. You can't be the bigger person if you're keeping score. And like if you're telling yourself, I need to be the bigger person, but you're having resistance because, well, Locke never does it. Locke's never the bigger person. There's a couple of problems there. One, you're not taking 100% responsibility for your relationship, right? Which some people might be like, yeah, whatever. But the other piece, which is very, very practical, is you have no clue what I'm doing in my head. This is the problem with self-development, working on your relationship, yourself, your parenting, all of these things. A lot of it is not tangible. You can't see it. It bites us in the ass because it's hard for us to see our progress sometimes, but it also bites our partners in the ass because they assume that just because they can't see what's going on, that it isn't going on. Not to mention the fact that we spent time away from each other too, right? But when you keep score, you're not going to be able to be the bigger person very often because you're going to be too worried about whose turn it is to be the bigger person, and then your relationship is going to go down the shitter. And so you're not going to be able to do what's best for your relationship if you're keeping score. That makes sense?
Yeah.
I was going to save that one for later, but you ruined it. So I brought it up.
You're welcome.
All right. Let's go through a couple examples of what we thought of when we read this quote, like examples or times where it's hard to do what's best. What would be more convenient or easier would be what is not best for the relationship. The first one I'll throw out for you is forgiveness. How do you feel about forgiveness versus resentment or whatever you want to call it? But tell us about forgiveness.
Tell you about forgiveness. Forgiveness is tough for me on so many levels. But when I think about forgiveness is tough because my personality and the way that I am from childhood wounds, from trauma and upbringing is like, prove it to me. Yeah. Like, why am I going to forgive you? Like, you haven't proven to me why I should forgive you. So forgiveness, I think for me, is like a time thing. And it's not as easy as saying, I'm sorry. And I'm just like over it and I'm going to move on, which I think that I've gotten better at and I'm working on. But it's like, well, I don't believe you.
Yeah. And there's something legitimate to that. To be completely honest with you, because we've talked apology languages before, which people can go and look up, and it's actually really interesting and impactful. But that's your apology language. I forget the exact name of it, but it's basically, okay, show me you're sorry by doing it differently. Yeah. So there's some pros and there's some cons to that. One immediate con that comes to my mind, because I'm usually on the receiving end of the prove it to me attitude. You don't say that, thankfully, but it's like, okay, but that takes time. So it's like, if I just screwed up this conversation, this difficult conversation, or we got into an argument, well, do we need to get into another argument for me to prove that I'm going to do it differently? Like that, while legitimate, it can be frustrating sometimes.
Interesting that you said that, though, because a lot of times in our relationship, things have re-happened again in different scenarios where you have had to prove the situation that you were going to do it differently. And it was by accident. Like, it didn't happen because we planned it, but there's been like very similar situations happened over and over again where like things have had to be proven different for it to be forgiven. It
was an opportunity. Yeah. Which we've talked about and I'm thankful for. And actually this idea where I was going with this, the prove it to me kind of attitude, is perfectly illustrating the quote that we're starting all of this with, which is, what's best for our relationship is for me to have some freaking patience and not have to solve this problem right now, right? To prove to you over time. And that's not most convenient for me. That's frustrating for me, right? But that's what you need. And I'm sure there are situations where the reverse is true, right? Where you've needed to do something in a way that was meaningful to me and kind of sacrifice that desire to do it your way on your end. I was going to say something else about the prove it to me attitude, and I kind of forgot where I was going.
I also think too with that, with anything, like, this is kind of off topic, but like personality test and like stuff like that, this isn't to go and abuse. Like, I think you can abuse like the prove it to me, like never good enough or never forgiving. And this isn't like an excuse to, if this is the way that you need to be apologized to and like forgive, okay, don't abuse that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's kind of where I was going, because I think what I was going to say about forgiveness is a choice.
Yes.
And I struggle with this. There's some people in my life that I need to forgive that I'm still struggling with that. But I'm wrapping my head around this concept that you make the decision to forgive first, and then you take actions on that decision, and then the feeling follows. And a lot of people might be like, whoa, 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 like we got to respect our feelings. And like you make it sound like forgiveness is like flipping a light switch. And that's not what I'm trying to say. Forgiveness is hard, but it all comes from a decision. And so we just use the prove it to me attitude as an example for what's best is me giving you some patience and some space and coming back and proving it next time. The flip side is just as true, which is what's best for our relationship is you also working on that same thing and working on making the decision to forgive and having trust and faith that I will prove it to you over time. And that while you're waiting for me to prove it, you don't have to cling to that resentment or whatever emotion it is, that you can make the decision to forgive because you trust me. If you don't trust me, why are we together? Like that kind of line of thinking. And I think it would be a whole lot easier to hang on to that resentment, to walk around angry and grumpy, but obviously that's not what's best for our relationship from either of us. And so there you go, both sides of forgiveness and the prove it to me attitude. I do want to say one thing real quick about, since we're talking about forgiveness, this is a question that has come up a couple of times for me, and I know for you, it kind of leads to this forgiveness versus resentment conversation kind of leads to a very inconvenient decision that some people might have to make in terms of ending a relationship, whether that's a marriage or not. Because the question that I had written down when it read underneath forgiveness was, if you can't forgive, why are you still in the relationship? If you're going to cling to this, why are you still together? Now, again, like there's that caveat that this is not easy. This is not overnight. But if you're not going to attempt and you're not going to really work at that, why are you guys still together? I just don't know if I can forgive him, like kind of conversations or her. And like I said, I'm not saying it's easy or quick, but it's a decision. And there may be times where honestly, what's best for the relationship might be to end it. I don't know. We have never made that decision, but I think we came close. I'm thankful that we didn't. But obviously that's a piece of the conversation. So I just wanted to throw that question out there. If you're not going to forgive, if you're going to cling to that forgiveness or cling to that resentment over forgiveness, why are you still in the relationship? And that's something for people to think about. All right. Another thing on my list, this is one that rears its ugly head every now and then for me, but it's this idea of just putting in the work. Like marriage is hard work. There's a lot of growth that needs to occur. Whether it's, times that I don't want to have to learn, or I don't want to have to read another relationship book, or you read something really good about this thing and I just don't feel like reading it right now, but I know it's important to you, or I don't want to listen to this podcast you sent me, or have this difficult conversation, whatever it is, putting in the work. There's a lot of times where I'm like trying to gauge whether it's worth it. And it always comes back to yes, right? But what's most convenient for me would be to go off and do something else and to not put in this work. But what's best for our relationship is that we're both putting in this work, whether we want to or not. We're both waking up, making it a habit. It's basically non-negotiable for us to be working on ourselves and working on the relationship. And I think that probably is the only thing I just mentioned. We came pretty close to probably having to end our marriage. That probably is, if we boil it down to one thing, that attitude of every day I'm going to work on me and I'm going to work on our relationship is probably the overall reason that we're still together.
Yeah, for sure. And I also think I heard someone say that love languages aren't really important. Like we all feel love from every love language. And while that may be true, I do really think that there are the one or two ways that we really, really feel it. And I think paying attention to that, because it's really easy to not love your partner in the way that they need to be loved, or not realize that they're not feeling loved in the way that they need to feel loved. I mean, we just had this conversation. I thought that I was doing a good job of loving you in one of your love languages, but you were feeling something different. Your perspective and what you were feeling was different. And I didn't get mad, but I was really thrown off for a whole day about it. I was in my brain, what? Is he serious? Really? And I was thinking over and over, but I talked to you later that day about that. I was I was really thrown off. You really threw me off.
Yeah.
And I think that's important because I know for me, like what my love languages are, and I know which one right now means more to me. And like when I'm not feeling loved in that way, then I can start to kind of feel it. And it's not to say that like that's an excuse to treat your partner not like poorly because they're not loving you. Like this also comes back to like you have a choice. Like, are you going to be the bigger person? Like rather they're loving you in your love language or not, like are you going to be the bigger person and still love them the way that they need to be loved, even if they're not loving you the way that you need to be loved?
Yeah.
And that's also not an easy decision and not convenient, but what's best for the marriage.
Right. And that goes right back to keeping score. And another way to phrase that is that's being transactional. You can't be transactional. It's like, well, she hasn't paid me in my love language, so I'm not giving her the goods in her love language or whatever it is. Yeah. And that's a perfect, okay. So one more thing about putting in the work, and then you gave us the perfect segue into the next one. You mentioned 5 love languages. It's a perfect example. Like if I think this probably actually happened, it feels like a memory more than an example. Like when you years ago brought the idea of love languages to me, I think I probably rolled my eyes about having to read a book about it.
You did.
Okay. And so there's a perfect example, putting in the work, like that concept. It's so simple. You almost don't have to read the whole book. Although the book hammers it home in a nice way. It's got lots of stories. I would definitely recommend the book. But even if you read like a Cliff Notes online version of like, what the heck is this? And then you went and you took the quizzes, like you could save yourself a little bit of time, but the concept has completely changed our relationship. It's, I don't want to overstate it, but it's been one of the best kind of frameworks that we brought into our relationship. We're not getting paid to say that. That's just an honest opinion. But in the beginning, like I didn't want to put in the work and read the book. And so what would we have missed if I didn't do that?
Yeah.
Right? So then the perfect segue, which you said we had this conversation about that specific love language recently. The next thing on my list, which is we may spend some time on this one or lump a couple of these together because this is really hard for me. And I think you're better than I am, but I think it's hard for you. I think it's hard for a lot of people, having difficult conversations. And within that, especially for me, like sharing how I'm feeling, like opening up. The buzzword is being vulnerable right now. Everybody overuses vulnerability, but like opening myself up in a vulnerable way, meaning I'm going to tell you how I feel and give you an opportunity to either accept that and love me through that, or just completely shoot me down and shame me and make me feel like I'm horribly wrong. This is really, really hard for me. You know, back to the quote, like it's best for our relationship, but it's incredibly hard. And it stems from a lot of different things for me, but my pattern has usually been, because I have this abandonment wound, it's usually like, oh, button up my feelings. Also because how society conditions men, I think it's safer to shove it down than to risk you not liking it, right?
Yeah.
Like the most important person in my life not liking it. But then that doesn't go well, as everyone who tries that knows. The emotions are going to come out. The feelings are going to come out. If I'm frustrated about something and I don't want to tell you, it turns into resentment and it becomes a problem. And I eventually explode or snap and act in a way that pushes you away. Ironically, the very thing I was trying to avoid.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people have witnessed or been the one instigating that pattern, right? So we understand how the difficult conversations are best for the relationship. And it would be way more convenient not to have them, but I think we understand that they are better for the relationship, but it still leaves us as like, how the heck do we have them? How do we take this knowledge that it's better to have these difficult conversations than to not, and actually have them? Because I know that very well. I teach that and I'm better than I ever was. And yet there are still times where I'm like, nope, don't want to talk about it. Not safe.
Yeah, there's so much that goes to that. This makes me think of kids for some reason. So when you're processing something or when you're going through something, there's a form of respect that needs to come from the opposite person wanting to be let in. Mm-hmm. So you think about, and I get angry with the kids about this, but then I realize you and I both do this. So you'll see clearly something's wrong with one of the kids. You'll say, what's the matter? Is something wrong? They'll be like, no, nothing. I'm fine. So you keep asking and they're like, no, I'm fine. You want them, you say to them, I can tell you something is wrong. Why can't you just tell me that something's wrong? They don't want to, because they know as soon as they tell you something's wrong, you're going to keep on bugging them and asking them what's wrong. They are not ready to share. And you have to trust that they will come back and share if you just let go. It's because you keep on pushing when it's not the time.
It's actually making it harder for them to come back.
Yeah. So I think relationships are a lot like this. Like, I'm thinking of you, for instance, and I'm speaking for you, and you can say your opinion after, but you're in a bad mood. I can clearly, like, it's all over your face when you're in a bad mood. Like, you don't hide that well. Just saying.
Oh, you've told me many times.
And I ask you, what's the matter? And you say nothing, I'm fine. And I'm like, okay, I could keep asking you and that's just going to be annoying. And if you do tell me something's wrong, like, I want to know what it is. Like, I want to talk about it, but you're not ready to talk about it. You have to trust that I'm going to leave you alone and know that, like, when you're ready to talk about it, you'll talk about it. But I also have to trust that that's what's going to happen, because you don't always come back and want to talk about it because it's hard for you to open up. But with that, there's been a lot of times in our relationship, and it doesn't even have to do with getting in a fight and you opening up to me about something that, like, is hard for you to say. Like, it's also about things that you got excited about that I didn't handle well. If you got excited about something, or you had this thought or this creative vision, and I was just like, oh yeah, that's cool.
That's stupid.
Then how are you going to, it's like kids. Like, if you're not excited about their small things, why are they going to want to share their big things? It's the same thing in a relationship. If you're not excited about the things that they get excited about, why are they going to want to share the intimate stuff that they're scared that you might get mad about? I think they're very similar.
I agree. I'll give you a couple tips, I guess, strategies, recommendations from my perspective. These are things that you and I have talked about, but give everybody listening a couple of things that, when you said, basically, I have to be able to trust that you're going to receive it well, you also have to trust that it's going to eventually happen. But here's a couple more things to keep in mind. And you talk a lot about this, so I'll say this and then I will let you explain it if you want. But one thing that immediately comes to mind that is important is learning how to listen. I don't know if you want to take that one away.
I mean, yeah, learning how to listen and not wait for your turn to, like, reply or say what you have to say.
Yeah.
I forget what I say, so you can.
It's just, put you on the spot.
Yeah.
I was going to make a joke and be like, well, I'll just read this and then I'll sit here and listen. This is important for me because, well, I think it's important for everybody. So when I'm opening up, I guess you could couple with learning how to listen, the second one I was going to say, which is don't get defensive, right? So getting defensive is obviously one way that you completely skip listening and just go straight to, yeah. But before you're done that sentence, let me tell you why the first half was wrong. Obviously, that's not listening, but listening to understand is the phrase you like to use. Obviously, it's not our phrase, but listening to understand rather than be understood, right? If I struggle opening up to you, or anyone struggles opening up to you in a relationship with the people listening, you want to work on being able to listen to understand what they're saying rather than for you to be understood. Like, there's a time and a place for your turn and for you to be understood. But if we're talking about what's best for the relationship and someone has a history of struggling to open up, number one, you can't get defensive. And number two, you got to learn how to listen. You got to be able to pay attention. You got to understand body language when you're listening, right? We talk a lot about body language and tone. Don't be crossing your arms. Don't be staring out the window. Those are negative kind of body language things. You could be nodding your head in agreement or mm-hmming as somebody says something important. Those are more positive body language and tone things that you could use. But just the concept of listening to understand them instead of waiting, I like the way you phrased it, waiting for your turn to talk. Those would be two big things that I would say would help me in being able to open up. And then it's on me to remember this quote, that what's best for the relationship is not always what's most convenient for me. And so what's most convenient for me is to just shut my mouth, button up, and not tell you that I'm annoyed about X, Y, or Z. But what's best for the relationship is to tell you, and to do it in a way and this is the key for me. So if anybody else struggles with this, the key for me is to, obviously there's a little bit of discernment and understanding what actually needs to be brought up, right? Like if I'm annoyed that you put the fork in the dishwasher upside down, that's not worth bringing up. But if I'm annoyed about something bigger that's going to sit and fester for 3 days and it's worth bringing up, I need to be able to make that decision between those two options, like important, not important. But the next step is I need to be able to do it early enough that I'm not so bottled up with anger and resentment that I'm just a total dick. Because when I come in as a total dick, obviously the conversation doesn't go well. Anytime I've ever delivered something to you appropriately, correction, feedback, feelings that I had, even if you completely disagreed, anytime I ever deliver them appropriately, you've always responded well. And even sometimes when I did deliver them inappropriately, badly, like a dick, you still responded well. But if we ever got in a fight, it was because I unloaded on you, because I held it in too long. And I need to remind myself repeatedly, like, of that history, that good history, that positive history. Like every time I do this, it goes well. And also, this is going to be best for our relationship. I need to do this. And those two things are on me and not really on you. So
yeah,
leave it at that. Connected to that, difficult conversations, a different wrinkle on that. And I kind of have this labeled two different ways. We can either think of it as standing up for yourself or setting boundaries. And so when I say standing up for yourself, what I mean is like times where I'll take a step back. In the history of our relationship, there have been times where I've been completely out of line and caused a lot of issues, bull in a china shop, emotionally kind of things, or with my words. There have also been times where you've been out of line and you've done something wrong, and I haven't called you out on it, or we would get in a fight over it. And then for the sake of repairing things, for the sake of, as we started off, like solving this right now, I would kind of soften my stance and either take responsibility for the fight or kind of let this, I guess we can say, correction, and saying like, hey, I'm sorry the way I reacted. At the same time, you were kind of out of line with this part. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't stand up for myself out of fear of kind of rocking the boat. And so it's become important to me, important to honoring myself, to be able to call you out. And that's where this standing up for myself phrasing came from. Like, hey, you did something I didn't like. It doesn't mean like you're a terrible person. This is not every day. But like when there's something bothering me, I don't feel true to myself when I swallow it out of fear of rocking the boat. And so that's where standing up for yourself comes from. But also in the same kind of category is setting boundaries. And I guess that could be with any kind of relationship, not just a romantic relationship. But when I say standing up for yourself or setting boundaries, specifically under difficult conversations, where does your mind go with those?
Our fighting style. For instance, like me needing to like get away. I can almost now, I'm not talking about previous years, can always tell when something is going to go south and we're going to get into a fight. And I know when to walk away and to like try to not have that fight. You do too for the most part, but there's times where I walk away, you need to let me walk away. And when you don't, it's almost like, you want to have a fight? It's like, do you really want to have a fight right now? Is that what you want? And that's what it feels like. So like having boundaries within that, being like, it's time to be done. Like we're both emotional. We're both not in a state where we can have a conversation. So like, let's just be done.
Yeah. I do think the flip side of that is the point that we're at, and it's taken us, 11 and a half years to get here, that we can actually receive correction from each other. I think that if you are able to receive it, that it's really important to deliver that for each other in moderation might be the right word. In moderation, within reason, right? Like you don't need to tell me every single thing I do wrong, but like if I'm speaking to one of the kids or you with a really terrible tone, a lot of times I don't even know it. And I need you to say like, can you change the way you're talking to her, please? Like she's really upset. And I need to be able to receive that correction, or like, I understand you're frustrated about this, but you're talking to me really rudely. Like if I'm talking to you like that, standing up for yourself like that, I think that is really important. If you can receive correction, it goes back to not getting defensive, right? That was the key for us, but being able to receive correction is also important.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. A couple more things on my list. We just had a conversation about this in the car the other day, a couple days ago. And one of the things that has helped me in doing what's best for our relationship as opposed to what's convenient for me is this idea that we need to be modeling a relationship for our kid, or modeling the relationship we want our kids to have. And so we were in the car the other day and you brought something up about our son. I've had this thought for years about our daughters and how I'm teaching them to see how a man acts in a relationship. But this was really impactful because it put it in a different light. Like, obviously you're incredibly important to me. I want to get better for you. I want to get better for myself. And sometimes I need a little extra motivation to do what is best for our relationship instead of what's most convenient. And the idea that they're always watching and that they're going to, I'll just speak from my perspective, that our 3 daughters are going to search for a relationship where the man treats them like the way I treat you. When I first realized that, to be honest with you, it kind of rocked my world and completely rearranged my kind of framework on being a dad. I don't know, I know from our conversation in the car that's been impactful for you too.
Well, yeah, I was looking at our son who was 13 and he's not dating yet, but I was thinking about it and him and I had a conversation and I was like, I haven't always been the greatest like wife, girlfriend, all of the above. And I was thinking of much younger version of me and him dating a younger version of me and being terrified. Like not wanting that for him and being like, I don't want that. And I was thinking about in his life, what he has seen me modeled as a girlfriend, as a wife. And I mean, I have changed a lot, but there is parts of me that he has seen that I'm not proud of. Yeah. And I would not want him to be with. So I definitely, it helps me step up my game and become a better model for him.
Yeah. The question of, the way I ask myself, the question is, would I be happy if my daughters married a man like me? Would you be happy if our son married a woman like you? And if you guys listening ask yourself that question, I think it can be incredibly motivating. And the last thing I want to say about that is a lot of people, when they ask that question, they then follow it up with some kind of guilt or shame about why their spouse wasn't enough to begin with. That was one of the immediate reactions that I got when I posted something about this one time. And it really bothered me. It was some sort of like, well, your wife should be important enough to you that you treat her the best you possibly can anyways without needing to have a daughter. Yeah. And it's like, okay, true. That's very true. And yet it's also not realistic for a lot of us. As much as you deserve that from me, it's not that easy. And so I don't think there should be any guilt or shame in needing that little boost of like, okay, yeah, the kids are watching. I should be doing this anyways for my wife, but the kids are watching and they need a better model. So get rid of the shame around that. I think that's BS, complete BS, to put it nicely. All right. I wanted to bring in this concept. This isn't so much a time where it's hard to do what's best, but it's a good topic to talk about, I think, in terms of how to do it. And it's this idea, I forget the name of the authors. I wish I could remember their names because they deserve credit. But this idea of the gap versus the gain, which we've talked about so many times. And it's the tendency that we have to focus on the gap between where we are and where we want to be, instead of noticing the gain of how far we've come from where we were to where we are. Obviously, you need to be able to see both. Obviously, you want to set goals. That gap between where you are and your goals is important to keep an eye on. But in a relationship, it's a lot easier to focus on the gap, all the problems that you still have, how far you still need to go. But it would be a lot better for the relationship to recognize how far your partner has come, how far you guys have come in the relationship, give each other the benefit of the doubt, and instead focus on the gain just as much, if not more than the gap.
Yeah, I always struggled with that, seeing the good, and I would only see the bad. I mean, I struggle with that not only within our relationship, but within myself. So that is a tough one.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting because there's always, and I don't use always lightly, there's always going to be tough times in life in your relationship. And I hadn't realized until I saw outside of just our marriage, I saw other marriages where I was talking to the same women consistently for a couple years where we would talk about marriage, how there is like this ebb and flow of like marriage going well, not going well, going well, not going well. And I think that when we're in it, it's really hard to see that it's going to be well again. And it was well before, and you made it through. Yeah. It's really, really hard to see. And for me, it's been eye-opening to be in relationships with women where we've talked about relationships for like a couple years, where I can see their relationship when it was good and then when it wasn't good, because then it helps me when I'm in it to know that I'm not always going to be in. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with us, and I'm not going to always be in it, because for a long time, even though the marriages that were in front of me growing up were not great, but for the longest time when we weren't well, I was like, we're over. It's done. Like we're getting a divorce. Like we're not going to make this. And it was just my way of thinking, like when things weren't easy or when things were tough, that like it was over. Like we weren't going to, we were just done. And I think a lot of people think like that. Like they just get so absorbed in the negative that they can't see the good.
Yeah. I think there's an important point in there too about just like one great way to reframe your perspective is to get around other people. Yeah. So I was making a joke about this on one of my calls the other day. Like I treat our kids like they're, depending on the child, 2, 3, maybe even 4 years older than they are. It's just natural. It's like we raise the standards, right? For what they is kind of where we want them to be. They meet those standards. They're incredible kids. And then I forget that, you know, our 4-year-old's 4 and she's not 7. And I'm like, why are you acting like that? It's like, well, because she's 4. And I do the same thing with all of our kids. And one of the best things for me, as much as I don't enjoy going to other people's kids' birthday parties, was like when we would go to birthday parties, I would get to see other kids. And this is not judgmental at all. And it's hard to tell the story without it making it sound like I'm judging other people's kids. I'm not judging other people's kids, but to see them around kids that are their age and to see the other kids their age and their flaws as well, and be like, oh yeah, they are supposed to be like that. Like, oh yeah, he is 13 or she is 6 or whatever it is. And like not being like, oh, my kid's so much better. Like they're not any better than other kids, but it reframed my perspective. And it's almost like what you just shared in a little bit of a different situation, like being able to hear about other people's relationships. Like you're not judging their relationships. You're not saying, oh, ours is better. It's just, oh yeah, they go through ups and downs too. We're not broken just because we're going through ups and downs. Yeah. And so getting around other people, other men, women, other people's kids, I don't know, whatever you need to do to reframe your perspective. I think that's, you know, back to the gap and the gain conversation. That's one way to see that other people have the same gaps as you sometimes, and to realize that your gap doesn't mean you're a piece of shit.
Yeah, for sure.
I wrote down this question because it came to my mind the other day. I thought it was really impactful, really important. And it goes with this like gap and gain idea. And like when you're growing together, when you and your partner are growing together, I think it's easy to assume past patterns will continue. So what I mean by that is like you're working on yourself. I'm working on myself. In the past, we had tendencies, patterns, habits, whatever it is. And if we're not careful, if I'm not careful, it's really easy for me to assume that because in the past when X happened, you've reacted with Y, that's going to continue. And I'll give you an example, but I'm going to ask you I'm going to read you the question first before I give you the example. The question I wrote down is, what would our relationship look like if we trusted that the other did the right thing when we weren't looking, instead of assuming the worst, instead of assuming that they did the wrong thing? And I'll give you this example that came to mind pretty quickly when I was thinking about this. We did a whole episode a long time ago, like a year or two ago, on why every man should track his partner's cycle. And it's about more than just like a woman's period and all of that stuff. There's different phases where different things are more likely or less likely to occur. There's a certain phase that's better for hard conversation, like all kinds of stuff. Go listen to that podcast episode if you want. But it became a double-edged sword for me. Because as I was tracking your cycle and learning more about this, early on, there were so many times that I assumed that a certain part of the cycle that's you happen to be in not as good a mood, more likely to be in not as good a mood, I would be rounding the corner into that cycle, or you would be rounding the corner, right? And I'd be keeping track of it. And I would just assume, here we go. Like, this is gonna suck. We've had fights like more commonly in this part of the cycle than any other part. That must mean we're going to get in a fight tomorrow. And so what would happen is I would be like imagining the fight in my head, and I would end up creating the fight. Like, I would end up coming into the conversation all bristly and prickly and angry. And like, the second you looked at me wrong because I was being kind of an ass, I'd assume that like, okay, here we go. And then I would start the fight and you would have been fine, right? Because I'm assuming the worst. Whether it's past patterns or just in general, I'm assuming the worst. In this case, it was both. I was assuming the worst past pattern. And so what would our relationship look like if we just trusted that the other did the right thing or was going to do the right thing instead of assuming the worst? I think it would be completely different. We avoided that mistake. But what do you think about that question?
Well, that also made me think of like past times where we've gotten in fights about like situations. I always go to money stuff, and you didn't handle it well. Mm-hmm. So then I would create the fight.
Oh, yeah.
I'd go in hot and create the fight because I just assumed that you were going to handle it the same way that you used to handle it. And then it was like, okay, there we go. We just got in a fight. And I totally just made that fight happen.
Because I was like, what the hell just happened?
Yeah.
What did I just walk into?
Yeah. So that's what that made me think of.
Yeah. I remember that. I remember, we're not even going to share the story, but I remember one particular fight in our old house. You were laying on the floor in our kitchen. I don't even remember what happened, but we got in a huge fight about money. And I felt like I had like whiplash, like physically whiplash. Like I just got sideswiped in a car accident or something. Like I had no clue where it came from. Anyways, let's wrap this up. Let's turn this into my question that I ask every time. We're going to do our best to answer it. How the heck do we do this? How the heck do we do what's best for our relationship, even though it's not the easiest or most convenient? Do you have anything? We hit on a couple already, right? Like, stop keeping score. Don't be transactional. Learn how to listen. Don't be defensive. Do you have anything else? Any other how-tos, suggestions for how the heck we do this?
I don't know. My things are like so blunt lately. It's like, stop making it about you.
I like that.
And I have to tell myself this often, by the way. This isn't like something that I'm like, oh yeah, it's wicked easy to say to yourself. But like when I'm in like a place of not wanting to do something, or because it's inconvenient, or I just don't want to, it's like, okay, actually, it's not about you.
Yeah. It's like the question I just asked. It's not about you. And so what would our relationship look like if you just assumed the best from me instead of assuming the worst?
Yeah. And remember also that like you're a team. Like,
yep.
You guys aren't against each other. You're for each other. I think a lot of the times we think that we're playing in the battlefield against each other. And it's like, no, we're in the battlefield fighting the same battle.
I agree. That reminds me of a quote, and I'm not going to get it perfectly right, but it's something like there's nothing that can, there's nothing out in the world that can ruin your relationship as long as you are fighting, as long as you stop fighting against each other and start fighting for each other. Yeah,
I think we said this in the last podcast too. I think it's so important because I think so many times in our relationship, I know for sure that we were fighting against each other. And I was like, wait, we're in this together. Like we're married, we're a team. We're not against each other.
Yeah, I agree. I got two things apart from what I just listed off. The first one is a little bit quicker than the second one, but the first one, you brought this to us. Actually, maybe I don't know. Whoever started this, we did it wrong for such a long time. But like regular check-ins, relationship check-ins, reviews, meetings, board of directors, State of the Union, whatever you want to call them. Everybody calls them something different. They didn't go well at first. I think we did a podcast episode about that too.
Oh, yeah.
We did all kinds of episodes. All right. But my point is, when you have, this was much more impactful for you than for me. We've already talked about how hard a time I have sharing difficult thoughts and feelings, but especially for you, having a set time to bring stuff up. For us, it happens to be either Sunday or Monday night. Having that set time already scheduled, you already know you're going to have the opportunity to bring stuff up. I think for a while when we started doing them right, that these meetings helped you, correct me if I'm wrong, not have to bring something up the second you saw it and were annoyed about it, but instead to give yourself a minute until that meeting, which then gave you the ability to exercise discernment and say, okay, is this still a problem 2 days later? Do I still need to bring it up, or can I let it go? And if it is a problem, then here's the forum to bring it up. If it's not a problem, then, ooh, thank God I didn't bring it up the day it happened.
Yeah.
Okay. So having these, if you want to learn about relationship meetings, there's an episode for that. The last thing I wanted to say, and actually, strangely enough, it is an idea that I got from reading David Goggins' book, which David Goggins is like a super badass ultramarathon runner, Navy SEAL, all kinds of things. And he wrote about one of the things that got him through Navy SEAL training. I think he had to do it 3 times to pass, was this concept of the cookie jar. And I might be completely taking his concept and changing it around in a way he doesn't like. I don't know. But the idea is like he's sitting in freezing cold water up to his nose, like they're trying to drown him. They're trying to get him to drop out, whatever it is. How do you maintain the motivation to keep doing that, to do the hard stuff, right? We're talking about some of this stuff is hard, maybe not as hard as SEAL training, but it's hard. And what he would do is when he was growing up, they didn't have a ton of money, but his mom always made sure there were cookies in the cookie jar. And so when he was having a bad day, not that food is the best coping mechanism, but he would go and he'd grab a cookie, and he always could count on there being a cookie in there. So he made a mental cookie jar. And when he was at SEAL training, he would remember back to previous instances of him making it through adversity, going through tough times, the things that he was proud of himself for doing, for not quitting. He's trying to keep himself from quitting at the time. And so I do this, and I would recommend that you guys do the same thing. And it's basically create a mental cookie jar for the times that doing what was hard, but best for your relationship, proved this quote true.
Yeah.
And instead of focusing, right? We talked a lot about like focusing on the bad, replaying the bad, focus on the good, replay the good. Have these memories of when I shared that I had to do this with you, like all of these times where I brought up difficult conversations, what I thought was difficult, guaranteed to go wrong, and you handled it perfectly. And you were welcoming, understanding, gracious, like it was not what I expected. It went well. I have to replay all of those times because my mind wants to just focus on all of the fights that we've had instead of remembering the good. And so make a mental cookie jar of the times that you've done this stuff and then it's gone well, so that in the future, when you try and resist it, you have proof that what's best for the relationship is not always what's most convenient for you. You have proof that that's true. You nod your head.
Yes.
We're an audio podcast. They can't see you right now, Ashley. All right. On that note, I'm not sure if Ashley's awake or if she's nodding off. We're gonna wrap it up. That's the end. Do you have anything you want to add?
No.
No? Okay, we can wrap this up before you go to sleep. All right, guys. Thanks for coming along on the journey with us this time.
Thanks, friends. Bye. Hi, friends. If you're enjoying the show, would you please leave a quick rating or review on Apple Podcasts for us? Doing this helps more people find the podcast, which means even more people can benefit from the conversations. We really appreciate you and your time, and thanks, as always, for listening.